The crowd roared with excitement as the lights dimmed in the massive MMA arena. The hum of anticipation filled the air, electric and charged. Fans from all walks of life gathered, ready for another epic showdown. But tonight's event was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would leave the arena buzzing for days. In the front row, sitting just out of the spotlight, was none other than Jason Statham. The British action star known for his roles in The Transporter, Crank and The Expendables wasn't here as a spectator. He was a fan of the sport, sure, but this night was supposed to be just another normal night out for him. Little did he know, his mere presence in the crowd would set the stage for an unforgettable confrontation. In the center of the ring, Mark the Bull Bradford was in the middle of his typical pre-fight showmanship. Known for his brash personality and trash-talking, Mark had a reputation for being one of the most arrogant fighters in the MMA world. His punches were brutal, and his ego even bigger. He thrived on riling up his opponents before they stepped into the cage, but tonight, he decided to take it one step further. "Hey, Statham!" Mark shouted from the center of the ring, his voice booming through the speakers. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Jason. "What the hell are you doing here sitting around like you're some kind of tough guy? You think just because you've been in a few action movies, you can hang with real fighters like me?" The crowd went silent for a moment. The audacity of his words hung in the air. People weren't sure whether to laugh or to brace for a fight. Some were excited, others were confused. Was this some sort of joke? But Jason's expression remained calm. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his usual stone-faced demeanor never wavering. Mark wasn't done. "Come on, Jason. Come down here, step into this cage. Show us what you've got. You're just a movie star, but let's see if you can survive a real fight." Jason's heart rate didn't skip a beat. It wasn't the first time he'd been taunted like this, but there was something about Mark's attitude that rubbed him the wrong way. The challenge wasn't just about fighting, it was about respect. Jason had spent years training in martial arts. He wasn't just a guy in movies who knew how to throw a punch. He was a guy who lived and breathed combat. But this wasn't something he had planned for. The crowd began to murmur, some cheering, others unsure of what would happen next. But all eyes were on Jason now. Would he take the bait, or would he walk away from the challenge? Jason stood up slowly, his eyes still locked on Mark. He knew the crowd was watching. He could feel the weight of their stares, the tension thickening in the air. The room went quiet as he took a few steps forward, moving closer to the ring. It was clear this wasn't going to end with just words. Jason approached the ring, his every move deliberate. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. He wasn't here to play games. As he climbed into the ring, the arena erupted in applause and whistles. Mark stood there with a smirk, clearly thinking this was his moment to prove a point. "Finally decided to grow some balls, huh?" Mark taunted, stepping toward Jason with an exaggerated swagger. Jason didn't flinch. Instead, he met Mark's gaze with a calm intensity. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to show you exactly what's real." Mark chuckled, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had made the right move. The crowd was split, half cheering for Jason, the other half supporting Mark. This was no longer just a fight. It was personal. "What happens next?" Jason asked, his voice low but clear. "We keep talking, or do we see who's the real fighter here?" Mark's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction he expected. Jason wasn't backing down. Jason wasn't intimidated. The tension in the air was palpable. Would Jason prove that he was more than just a movie star? Or would Mark's bravado and MMA experience take the win? But before we dive into what happens next, make sure to hit the subscribe button. This story is just getting started, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. As the crowd's roar continued to echo through the arena, Jason Statham stood in the cage, his eyes locked on Mark the Bull Bradford. Mark might have been the one taunting, but it was Jason who had the last laugh in moments like this. For those who only saw Jason as an action star, they didn't know the real story, one that stretched far beyond the movie sets. Jason wasn't just another Hollywood tough guy. Before his rise to fame as one of the most iconic action stars in the world, he had built a life full of physical discipline and personal sacrifice. His journey had begun long before the lights of Hollywood, long before the world knew him as Frank Martin or Chev Chelios. It started in the gritty world of street fighting, martial arts, and a relentless pursuit of self-mastery. Born and raised in Shirebrook, England, Jason's childhood wasn't filled with the glitz and glamour of the film industry. It was filled with hard knocks and fighting for respect. His father, a street seller, and his mother, a dancer, weren't the ones who would push him into fame. They taught him the value of hard work and resilience, qualities that would shape the man he would become. But it wasn't until his teenage years that Jason would discover the art of combat. His first foray into martial arts came when he started training in karate at the age of 12. By the time he was a young adult, Jason had earned a black belt, and his skills didn't go unnoticed. A few years later, he would join Britain's national diving squad, competing at a high level and even earning a spot on the team for the 1990 World Championships. His athleticism wasn't limited to just diving, though. Jason also trained in kickboxing and boxing, becoming a well-rounded fighter in various disciplines. It wasn't long before his talent was spotted by the legendary director Guy Ritchie, who was looking for someone with the right physicality for his film Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. Jason's natural charisma and tough guy presence landed him the role, and the rest was history. But what people didn't realize was that Jason wasn't just reading lines and pretending to throw punches. He was applying years of real-life experience in combat. Even during his action-packed Hollywood career, Jason remained grounded in martial arts. He continued to train intensively in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, kickboxing and boxing. When he wasn't filming, he was in the gym or on the mat, honing his skills. He never took the fame for granted, always respecting the craft of fighting that had shaped his life long before the cameras started rolling. So, when Mark Bradford, with his flashy taunts and cocky attitude, challenged him in front of thousands, Jason didn't flinch. This wasn't just about his career as an actor. This was about defending his honor as a fighter who had spent his life in the gym, in the ring, and on the streets. He wasn't about to let some arrogant MMA fighter undermine everything he had worked for. Mark stood across from him, his chest puffed out with confidence. "You gonna stand there all day, or are we going to see what you're made of, Statham?" he jeered. Jason's calm demeanor never wavered. "I'm not here to talk," he replied coolly. "I'm here to show you what real fighting is." The tension between the two men was thick. Jason wasn't just taking on Mark's challenge. He was stepping into the ring to remind everyone watching that the real fight had nothing to do with Hollywood scripts and everything to do with respect. For Jason, this was personal. He wasn't the guy who waited for an invitation to fight. He was the guy who showed up when called, ready to back up every word with action. As the fighters prepared to square off, Jason's mind was focused, his body alert, his years of training kicking in. The crowd could feel it. This wasn't a simple brawl between two egos. This was about proving something much deeper. And Mark had no idea what he was in for. The brash taunts, the cocky swagger. None of that mattered when you were up against someone who had spent decades perfecting their craft. This fight wasn't just a clash of physicality. It was a battle of experience, of discipline, and of honor. Jason was ready. But was Mark? The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing second. Mark, the Bull Bradford, had made his first move, but his brash show of aggression had failed miserably. Jason Statham's calmness in the face of such taunts was unnerving to Mark, who was used to breaking his opponents with his words and his speed. But Jason wasn't just any opponent. He wasn't intimidated, and he wasn't here for the theatrics. He was here to fight, and that was something Mark hadn't quite accounted for. Jason didn't say another word as Mark stumbled back, his fists clenched tightly in frustration. For the first time, Mark's arrogance seemed to be slipping. The crowd could feel it. The undercurrent of tension was palpable, the air vibrating with anticipation. It wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a battle for dominance. And Jason was proving with every move that this was a fight Mark wasn't prepared for. "Is that all you got?" Jason asked again, his voice steady and sharp. His confidence was so unshakable that it almost made Mark's bravado look foolish. The silence in the arena deepened. with every eye fixed on the two fighters. Mark's chest heaved in anger. The cocky smile he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. He wasn't just going to back down, he was going to make Jason regret stepping into his ring. With a growl, Mark charged again, this time more strategically, his fists throwing powerful jabs, hooks, and uppercuts in rapid succession. Each punch seemed to carry with it a piece of his ego, and he wasn't about to let Jason outmaneuver him again. Mark had built his reputation on his raw power, and now he was going to prove it, but Jason was still a step ahead. Every time Mark launched an attack, Jason slipped out of the way, his footwork graceful and calculated. He wasn't simply dodging punches, he was dissecting Mark's rhythm, learning his tells. Jason wasn't fighting with emotion, he was fighting with his mind. Mark's frustration started to show. He was wild now, attacking with even more ferocity, hoping that raw aggression would make up for his lack of control. The crowd began to murmur nervously, sensing the shift in the fight's dynamics. Mark was losing his composure. His attacks were no longer measured. They were desperate. Jason saw it. He saw Mark's anger clouding his judgment, making him sloppy. The moment he'd been waiting for was coming. But Jason wasn't rushing in to capitalize on Mark's mistakes. He wasn't panicked. He waited, staying cool, his breathing steady, as if he were in the gym working on his technique. The seconds dragged on and Mark grew more erratic. Finally, the opening Jason had been waiting for came. Mark's left arm swung in a wide, uncontrolled arc, leaving his body vulnerable for a brief fleeting moment. Without hesitation, Jason stepped in. He moved with surgical precision. Jason dodged the wild swing, closing the gap between them in an instant. With a sharp pivot of his hips, he delivered a perfectly timed jab to Mark's ribs, a strike that sent shockwaves through Mark's body. The impact was clean and hard, a reminder that Jason wasn't just playing around. He was the real deal. Mark grunted, staggering back, gasping for air. The punch had landed with more force than he expected. The crowd gasped in unison, and for the first time in the fight, Mark was the one on the defensive. His arrogance faltered. The overconfidence that had driven him earlier was now replaced by a nagging fear, one that was hard to shake. Jason didn't give him a moment to recover. He advanced, stepping into Mark's space and forcing him back with quick, sharp strikes. His movements were fluid, controlled, and utterly effortless. Mark tried to retaliate, throwing wild punches, but his attacks were slow and predictable. Now, Jason blocked one of his punches and then countered with a clean left hook that landed directly on Mark's jaw. The sound of impact echoed through the arena. Mark's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. The crowd erupted in cheers, some stunned, others cheering for the underdog. Mark was hurt. Jason had not only physically outclassed him, but mentally broken his rhythm. He wasn't just in a fight with Jason. He was fighting his own ego. But Jason wasn't finished. With a controlled calmness, he kept Mark on the defensive. Each strike he threw was a message. You may be big, you may be fast, but you're not. Invincible, Mark, now visibly frustrated, wiped a trickle of blood from his lip. His fists clenched tighter, and his breathing became more erratic. He was determined not to back down, to not let this fight slip from his grasp. He had been the one in control for so long, but now everything was slipping away. His mind raced and his confidence was dwindling. This was no longer about strength, it was about survival. Jason's eyes never left Mark's. There was no anger, no rush to finish him. Jason knew this moment was about something more than the fight itself. It was about teaching Mark a lesson he wouldn't forget. That ego, no matter how large, would never outlast experience and discipline. The fight had turned in Jason's favor, but it was far from over. Mark still had enough pride to make this a battle worth watching. As the fighters circled, each man knew something the crowd didn't. This was the beginning of something bigger. The sound of the crowd faded as Jason Statham and Mark Bradford locked eyes in the center of the cage. Both men stood motionless for a split second, catching their breath. But while Mark was clearly rattled, Jason remained composed, almost as if he was savoring the battle. This fight wasn't just physical, it had become a psychological war. Jason knew that Mark's pride had been wounded, and from this point on, it was only a matter of time before the MMA fighter's desperation led him to make a mistake. Mark's fists were still raised, but his posture was different now, tense, rigid like a wild animal ready to strike without thinking. He was still trying to regain control, but it was clear the mental game had shifted. Jason's calm confidence had broken down the arrogance that had fueled Mark's attacks. He wasn't just fighting for victory anymore, he was fighting to hold on to what was left of his pride. For Jason, this wasn't just about fighting Mark, it was about proving to himself that his years of training, discipline, and experience in martial arts were not just things he used in the movies. This was real. The stakes were higher than just winning or losing a match. It was about legacy, about showing the world that no matter what, he would stand firm. And the more Mark pushed, the more Jason knew he had to hold steady. The next few moments were a blur of movement. Mark, now more aggressive than ever, lunged at Jason with everything he had. His fists flew in rapid succession, hoping to land a blow to show Jason that he wasn't finished. But Jason moved like water, fluid, calm, unhurried. He slipped past Mark's wild strikes with an ease that could only come from years of practice. Every time Mark got close, Jason was just out of reach, dancing around him like a seasoned fighter who knew exactly how to read his opponent. Mark's movements grew sloppier as his frustration mounted. He was swinging faster now, trying to overwhelm Jason. But in doing so, he was leaving himself open. Jason's eyes gleamed with the understanding of how this fight would end, but he wasn't rushing. Every time Mark's punch missed, Jason's counter was swift, each blow a reminder that experience was the true weapon in this cage. Mark's breathing became heavier as his energy started to wane. Jason, on the other hand, had paced himself. He knew how to manage his stamina, and he had no intention of allowing his emotions to control him. He was letting Mark exhaust himself. The cage was Jason's domain now, and Mark had only just begun to realize the depth of the mistake he'd made by underestimating him. With a sudden, swift movement, Jason feigned a retreat, making Mark think he had an opening. Mark, desperate to turn the tide in his favor, lunged forward, leaving himself vulnerable. This was the moment Jason had been waiting for. In a flash, Jason sidestepped Mark's charge, grabbed hold of his arm, and expertly spun him around. With a perfectly executed takedown, Jason brought Mark crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped in shock as the momentum of the fight shifted completely. Mark was disoriented for a moment, lying on his back, trying to regain his bearings. Jason stood over him, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on his opponent. For Mark, this was a nightmare. He had been on the attack, had believed that his strength and aggression would be enough to overpower Jason, but now he was at Jason's mercy. And Jason wasn't about to make it easy for him. Jason didn't immediately go for a submission or a finishing blow. Instead, he knelt down beside Mark, his expression a mixture of respect and resolve. "You've got heart, but you don't know how to control it," he said, his voice low but clear. "You can't win a fight with pride alone. You need discipline." Mark gritted his teeth trying to get up, but Jason's control was impeccable. With a swift motion, he pinned Mark's arms down, maintaining his superior position. The fight had shifted into a different territory now, one where Mark's strength meant little in comparison to Jason's technical expertise. The crowd erupted into cheers as they watched the fight unfold, clearly witnessing the turning point. Mark, exhausted and demoralized, struggled beneath Jason's grip, but he had lost all the advantages. His wild attacks had cost him, his pride had cost him, and Jason had been patient enough to take full advantage of it. As Mark flailed, Jason moved with precision, positioning himself to end the fight once and for all. The arena was on the edge of their seats, waiting for the inevitable. Jason's years of training, honed through countless hours in the gym and in real combat, had brought him to this moment. This wasn't about acting. It wasn't about playing a role on a set. This was about raw skill, honed over a lifetime. With one final calculated move, Jason transitioned into a chokehold, his forearm locking in place with such precision that Mark couldn't escape. The crowd held its breath as Mark's attempts to break free grew weaker. his body slowly giving in to the pressure. Jason's grip remained unyielding. Mark's strength had been outmatched. His fight had come to an end. The referee moved in, signaling the victory. "It's over," he shouted, and the arena erupted in wild applause. Jason stood, his face as calm as ever, his breath steady. The fight had been brutal, but he had won with the grace and control of a true martial artist. Mark was helped to his feet, defeated, his arrogance shattered. Jason turned to the crowd, acknowledging their cheers, but he didn't let the applause get to him. This fight wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't for the spectacle. It was for something deeper, something he had known from the start. Discipline and experience always win out in the end. As Mark slowly walked off the mat, Jason stood tall in the cage, a man who had proven that true strength comes from within, not from empty words or bravado. The fight had been a journey, not just for Mark, but for Jason as well. A journey that had tested his skills, his patience, and his resolve. The story wasn't over yet. The arena had witnessed a lesson in humility, a lesson that Mark Bradford and anyone else who doubted Jason Statham would not soon forget. Don't miss the next chapter. What happens after this fight will change everything. Subscribe now to follow the story as it unfolds. The arena still buzzed with excitement as Jason Statham stood victorious in the cage. The crowd's deafening cheers filled the air, but there was something different now, something heavier. Mark Bradford, defeated and humiliated, was making his way off the mat, his pride in tatters. Jason, on the other hand, stood in the center, his calm demeanor almost unsettling after such an intense battle. For a moment it seemed like time had slowed down, and all that could be heard were the chants of the crowd, echoing through the arena. Jason's victory had been decisive. He had outclassed Mark at every turn, and the fight had ended with a clear, overwhelming display of skill and control. But for Jason, this victory wasn't just about proving he could fight. It wasn't even about silencing an arrogant opponent. It was about something much deeper, something personal. Jason's mind drifted back to his early years, before the fame, before the Hollywood action movies. His journey had been built on real combat, real struggles. He wasn't just an actor who learned how to fight on set. He was someone who had spent decades sharpening his mind and body. The fight with Mark wasn't just a way to prove his strength. It was a reminder of everything he had fought for in life. As the last of the applause echoed around him, Jason turned to face the crowd. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But there was no celebration on his face, no smile. His victory had been quiet, almost solemn. He wasn't here for the adoration. He was here for the lesson. The lesson he had just taught Mark, and perhaps even himself. But it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. As Jason stood there, still composed, Mark, his face red with embarrassment, stormed back into the cage. His earlier arrogance had dissolved into a seething anger. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. "Hey," Mark shouted, his voice full of venom, his fists clenched. "You think you've won, huh? Just because you had one good move? One lucky shot?" Jason didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. Mark wasn't going to walk away quietly. His ego was too big, and he had to have the last word. He couldn't let go of his loss, and that would be his undoing. "You didn't win, Statham," Mark continued, his voice growing louder. "You may have beaten me today, but I'll be back. And next time I'm going to crush you. You'll regret thinking you could take me down." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of Mark's humiliation. The crowd, sensing the tension, grew quiet. They were watching something shift, something deeper than the physical fight. Mark's anger wasn't just directed at Jason. It was aimed at everything he had lost in this moment. His pride, his reputation, his self-worth, all of it was crumbling in front of him. Jason finally stepped forward, meeting Mark's fiery gaze with a calmness that seemed almost unnerving. He could see the pain in Mark's eyes, the rawness, of defeat. Mark wasn't just upset about losing the fight. He was upset about being forced to confront the truth he had been avoiding, that all the arrogance, all the bravado, had only been a mask for his own insecurities. "You don't get it, do you?" Jason said, his voice steady but full of underlying emotion. This isn't about one fight, one win, or one loss. It's about respect. It's about understanding that no matter how strong you are, how fast you are, you'll always be vulnerable. If you don't have the humility to learn from your mistakes. Mark's face twisted in anger, but Jason's words had found their mark. He saw it in Mark's eyes. He was angry, but deep down, he knew Jason was right. He had been so consumed with proving his dominance that he had overlooked the most important lesson of all. True strength came from within, not from external validation. The crowd, which had been quiet during this exchange, began to murmur again. They had witnessed the physical fight, but this moment, was where the real battle had been fought. It wasn't just a fight for victory. It was a fight for respect, for growth, for understanding. Jason had shown Mark something he hadn't been prepared for, that power and aggression were nothing without control, without wisdom, and without humility. Mark, now breathing heavily, took a step back. He knew the words Jason had spoken were true, but the realization stung. He wasn't ready to accept it, not yet, but it had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, one that would stay with him long after the fight was over. As Mark turned and stormed off, the crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and cheers. They had witnessed a fight, but more importantly, they had witnessed a man confront his own limitations. They had witnessed Jason Statham, not just as a fighter, but as a teacher. Jason stood alone in the cage for a moment longer, his eyes on the spot where Mark had just stood. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't celebrating. He was reflecting on the battle, the emotional battle, as much as the physical one. This fight had been about more than just winning. It had been about showing Mark that the path to true strength lay not in arrogance or pride, but in the ability to adapt, to learn, and to grow. But even as he stood there, Jason couldn't help but wonder, what would come next? Was this really the end of the story? Or was there more to this rivalry than just one fight? Would Mark take this lesson to heart? Or would he continue down the path of arrogance, trying to prove something that couldn't be proven? The emotional weight of the moment hung heavily on Jason's shoulders, but he knew one thing for sure. This fight had changed both of their lives forever, and whatever happened next, Jason was ready. The arena had emptied, and the energy of the crowd had faded into the quiet hum of distant voices and the echo of Jason Statham's victory. Back in the locker room, Jason was alone, sitting on a bench, his hands resting on his knees. The fight was over, but it felt as though the emotional weight of the evening was just beginning to settle on him. He had won, yes, but the victory felt bittersweet. There was no sense of triumph in his expression. The usual adrenaline of the win, the rush of having faced off in the cage, was absent. It wasn't that Jason didn't appreciate the fight, he did. But what he valued more than the physical win was the message that had been delivered, both to Mark and to himself. He leaned back, allowing his thoughts to drift to the lessons he had learned in the fight. Mark's arrogance had clouded his judgment, and Jason knew that it had been his own patience, his control, that had ultimately led to victory. But it wasn't just about physical technique. It had been about staying grounded. It had been about understanding that the real battle wasn't just with fists and muscles. It was with the mind, with ego, with the part of a person that drove them to believe they were invincible. Jason understood that better than most. His career had always been built on hard work and sacrifice. From his humble beginnings to the bright lights of Hollywood, Jason had experienced his fair share of struggles and setbacks. He wasn't someone who took success for granted. He had worked relentlessly to get where he was, not just in the movies, but in life. But even though he had faced challenges, even though he had fought tooth and nail to achieve his dreams, Jason never let his pride overtake him. He'd seen firsthand the damage it could cause. He had watched others crumble under the weight of their own egos, and he had always tried to avoid falling into that trap himself. Yet Mark, in his arrogance, had believed that a few years of success in the MMA world meant he could take on anyone, even Jason. And when Mark was confronted with the reality that his bravado was hollow, he had lashed out. Jason understood that kind of reaction all too well. He had seen it before, not just in the ring but in life. As he sat there, Jason reflected on his own journey. He thought about the sacrifices he had made, the relationships that had been tested, the times when he had doubted himself. But every step of that journey had brought him closer to understanding one crucial thing. True strength came from humility and resilience, not from pride, not from proving oneself to others, but from the quiet conviction that no matter how hard the world pushed, you had to keep going. Jason had hoped that Mark would walk away from the fight with that same realization. But he knew it wasn't going to be easy for him. Mark's defeat was only the beginning of his own personal battle. The arrogance he carried with him would take time to break down. Jason knew that the road to redemption, if Mark was willing to take it, was long, and it wasn't something that could be won in a single fight. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from his old training partner, Charlie. "Great fight, mate. You were calm, controlled, and you taught Mark a lesson he'll never forget." "Proud of you," Jason smiled softly. Charlie's words meant more to him than he let on. He wasn't just fighting for glory or accolades. He fought for respect, for the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was living his truth. That was the real reward. Another message followed from his manager. "You've made a name for yourself, Jason. People are talking about this fight. It's making waves. I'm proud of you. Let's get the press on board, but remember, you've always been about the fight, not the fame." Jason let out a quiet sigh. Fame had never been his driving force. It had never been about the spotlight, the applause, or the cameras. It had always been about the craft, about testing his limits, about proving to himself that he could stand strong in the face of adversity. Fame came and went, but a fighter's true legacy was built on how they faced their battles, both inside the ring and outside of it. As the minutes passed and the room quieted, Jason felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The fight with Mark wasn't just a physical victory. It was a battle for respect, for self-awareness, for understanding that every fight, whether in the cage or in life, was a reflection of who you were and how you approached the world. In that moment, Jason knew he had done more than win a fight. He had shown everyone, especially Mark, that true strength wasn't about crushing your opponent or proving how tough you were. It was about learning from your mistakes, acknowledging your vulnerabilities, and never letting your ego dictate your actions. Jason stood up, stretched his muscles, and looked at himself in the mirror. His body was bruised, tired, but it was a reminder of what he had accomplished. And more than that, it was a reminder of the journey that still lay ahead. The road to understanding wasn't a straight line. It was filled with bumps, setbacks, and challenges. But it was the only road worth traveling. As he walked out of the locker room, Jason felt a sense of calm he hadn't expected. The fight had been won, the lesson had been taught, and now it was time to move forward. There were more battles to be fought, more lessons to be learned, and Jason Statham was ready for whatever came next. The sun had set as Jason Statham stepped out of the arena into the cool night air. The streets of the city were quieter now, but the echoes of the evening's events lingered in his mind. The fight, the lessons, the emotional weight of it all. It wasn't just something that could be left behind in the cage. It followed him, like a shadow as he walked to his car. He wasn't alone in this journey. In fact, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been part of this story, and those who had watched it unfold. As Jason slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at his phone. Dozens of notifications, calls, text messages, and most of them were about the fight. But one caught his eye, an unexpected message from Mark Bradford. "You were right. I don't know what I was thinking. I've got a lot to work on. Maybe one day we'll meet again." Jason read the message twice. He wasn't sure what he expected from Mark, but this wasn't it. The raw honesty in those words, the acknowledgement of his flaws, was something Jason hadn't anticipated. It made him think. Maybe Mark wasn't as lost as he seemed. Maybe, just maybe, this defeat would be the beginning of his redemption. Jason took a deep breath, shaking his head. The fight was over, but the ripple effects were still moving. And it wasn't just about the two of them. The world had watched this fight. Millions of people had tuned in. They had witnessed something that wasn't just about the physical confrontation. They had seen the power of humility, the strength of resilience, and the quiet wisdom that came from knowing when to fight and when to step back. Jason's phone buzzed again, another message. This time it was from one of his close friends, Matt, who had watched the fight from the sidelines. "Hey mate, that was incredible. I gotta admit, I didn't think you'd be able to keep your cool with Mark running his mouth, but you showed everyone what it's all about. You've always been a fighter, Jason, but tonight you showed what real strength is. Respect." Jason smiled, reading the message. This too was part of it. The recognition, not just for his skills, but for his character. It wasn't just about the fight in the cage. It was about how you carried yourself outside of it, how you responded when the world was watching, and how you treated others in your moments of victory and defeat. And so Jason took a moment to reflect. The fight had been intense, the emotions had been high, but it was the lessons learned along the way that would stick with him. Mark, despite his arrogance, had been human. Jason had been reminded of that. The ego, the pride, the bravado, they were all just masks people wore to hide their vulnerabilities. And what he had seen in Mark was what he had seen in so many others in his life. Fear of failure, insecurity, and a desperate need to prove something to the world. Jason had come to realize that winning wasn't always about dominating others. It was about dominating your own weaknesses, understanding your own flaws, and embracing the truth of who you were. That was the real victory. He had taken a step toward that understanding, and perhaps so had Mark. As Jason drove through the city streets, the faint hum of his engine was the only sound that accompanied him. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the kind of silence that felt peaceful, as if everything had settled into place. The fight had ended, but the journey, both for him and for Mark, was far from over. And that's where the story would continue. It wasn't about what happened in the ring anymore. It was about what would happen next. Would Mark learn from his mistakes and become a better man? Would he find the humility Jason had shown him? Would the public's perception of Jason change too? The fight had been a chapter, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story. Jason thought about it for a moment, and then he chuckled to himself. The world was full of unexpected twists. This fight, this battle, had been full of them. And if there was one thing Jason knew, it was that the real challenge lay in how you responded to the challenges life threw at you. He parked the car in front of his apartment and sat there for a moment, just looking at the city. The lights flickered in the distance, and the world kept moving as it always did. Jason knew that no matter how many victories he had, there would always be another fight waiting. But as long as he stayed true to himself, no matter what happened, Jason was ready for it. The real fight wasn't in the cage, it was in life. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. So what do you think? If you've been watching Jason's journey, you've probably picked up a few lessons along the way. And now, it's your turn. What would you do if you were in Mark's shoes? Would you rise to the challenge and learn from your mistakes, or would you let your ego dictate your actions? The following days after the fight felt almost surreal for Jason. The buzz around his victory hadn't died down. In fact, it was growing louder. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, congratulated him, or wanted a moment to speak about the match. It was a feeling that Jason had grown used to over the years, especially given his Hollywood career. But this was different. The respect he had earned from both the fight and his ability to remain composed had struck a chord with people. And it wasn't just fans and reporters who were talking. Fighters, trainers, and even analysts were acknowledging something deeper in Jason's actions. Jason had been trained for a lifetime to fight in front of cameras, but this was more than just the latest role in a film. This was real. This was about teaching through action, not words. And the lessons Jason had taught, humility, strength, patience, were resonating deeply. It wasn't just about the knockout in the ring. It was about how he handled the moments after. His quiet words with Mark, the lessons of respect he'd imparted, were now being discussed by many. Still, even amidst all the attention, Jason couldn't shake a feeling that had been tugging at him. Despite his victory, despite the recognition and validation, something inside him felt like there was more. He had gone toe-to-toe with Mark, yes, but he knew deep down that it was only a small chapter in the larger story. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, Jason couldn't ignore the fact that there were others who might need that same lesson. The lesson he had just taught Mark. But this time, maybe the challenge wouldn't be just in the ring. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, after a training session, Jason received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was not. "Jason, it's Charlie," came the voice of his old training partner and friend. "I've been following everything. Looks like the world's finally catching up with the deer. Kind of fighter you've always been. But listen, there's something I want you to consider." Jason raised an eyebrow. "What's up?" Charlie hesitated before speaking. "I've got an opportunity for you. It's not your typical fight. I've got a guy who's been watching you. He's a former champion, retired, but still hungry for one more fight. He's been hearing about what happened with Mark, and he's intrigued by you. He wants to challenge you. He's got a reputation for being brutal. Not in the cage, but outside of it. It's something that could get ugly. Fast." Jason paused, leaning back in his chair. He knew Charlie well enough to understand that if this was serious, it was something to consider. Charlie didn't typically reach out for just any fight, especially not with someone who had a reputation as notorious as this person's. "And what do you think?" Jason asked, his voice calm. "I think you need to hear him out. This isn't about showing off. It's about proving to the world and to yourself that your victory over Mark wasn't a fluke, that it wasn't just about keeping your cool with one fighter, but about staying grounded no matter who steps into that ring." Jason's mind raced. The quiet, reflective space he had just found in the aftermath of his fight with Mark was suddenly disrupted by this new challenge. This wasn't something he had planned. It wasn't something he sought. But, knowing Jason as a fighter, the whole idea of a new challenge was irresistible. "I'll think about it," Jason finally replied. "But tell me one thing, who is this guy?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "His name is Rick the Beast Harrison. He was a champion at one point, powerhouse in the ring, but he's known more for his exploits outside the cage these days. He has a reputation for getting under people's skin, creating chaos, and pushing fighters to their limits. Some say he's as dangerous outside the ring as he was inside it." Jason could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't the fear of facing someone like Mark. It was the thought of confronting someone who didn't just fight for titles or glory, but for a different, darker reason. This wasn't a fight to show the world how good Jason was. This was a fight about testing his soul. "I've got a lot on my plate, Charlie," Jason said slowly, "but I'll think about it. All right, just remember, Jason, sometimes the toughest fights are the ones you don't see coming." Jason hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation settling in his chest. He looked out the window, his thoughts drifting. He wasn't looking for fame, not anymore. He wasn't looking for the next big pay-per-view event. But there was something about Rick Harrison's challenge that stirred something deep inside him. Maybe it wasn't just about fighting for victory this time. Maybe it was about proving something deeper. Jason stood up from his desk, his decision slowly beginning to take shape. This wouldn't be an easy fight. In fact, it might be his toughest challenge yet. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't done proving who he was, both in the cage and in life. He'd learned a lot from his fight with Mark. But this was something different, something that would test his character in ways he hadn't experienced before. And as he laced up his shoes and grabbed his gym bag, Jason knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But the question lingered in his mind. Would he be able to face the darkness that Rick Harrison would bring? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. If you thought Jason's last fight was the end, think again. A new challenge is on the horizon, and it's going to be more than just a physical battle. Will Jason rise to the occasion? Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The real fight is about to begin. Jason stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His face was bruised, his body sore from the previous fight with Mark. Yet it was a different kind of fatigue that weighed on him now. The fight with Mark had been a moment of personal triumph, a victory for respect and humility. But the upcoming challenge, facing Rick the Beast Harrison, was something else entirely. Jason had always fought for titles, for the thrill of the competition. But this fight felt personal. It felt darker, like it would test more than his physical endurance. It would test his soul. He had always prided himself on being grounded, a fighter who was in control of his emotions, who could stay calm and composed under pressure. But everything he had learned from his last fight, the lessons of patience, humility, and strength, now seemed like preparation for something much bigger than he had anticipated. Rick Harrison was no ordinary opponent. His reputation in the MMA world was legendary, but not for the right reasons. He had built a career on chaos, intimidation, and mind games. He was known to push fighters to their breaking point, to break them mentally and emotionally before they even stepped into the ring. And now Jason was the target of that same ruthless energy. Jason took a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. He knew what he was getting into, but that didn't make it any easier. He had trained for years to face the toughest opponents in the world. But this was different. Rick Harrison wasn't just a fighter. He was a force of nature, someone who didn't play by the rules, someone who thrived on the fear he instilled in others. This wasn't just about fighting skills. This was about mental toughness. It was about the strength to face someone who wanted to break him, to turn him into another victim in his wake. As Jason arrived at the training facility the next morning, his mind was sharp. He knew that he had to prepare for this fight in a way he had never prepared before. This wouldn't be a simple clash of fists and skill. He needed to tap into a different part of himself. He needed to get inside Rick's head before Rick could get inside his. The gym was quiet, save for the sound of punching bags being hit and the rhythm of footsteps on the mat. Jason's trainer, Ben, was waiting for him. Ben had been with Jason from the very beginning of his career, and Jason trusted him more than anyone. "Ready for this?" Ben asked, sizing up his fighter. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, concern maybe, or perhaps understanding. Ben knew the stakes. Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the corner of the gym where a series of heavy bags hung. He began to throw punches, focusing on the rhythm of his movement, letting his mind fall into the familiar cadence of training. His body moved instinctively, as if the fight was already happening in his mind. The physical training was second, nature, but it was the mental preparation that would truly make the difference. Ben watched him for a few moments before speaking again. "You're not just fighting Harrison in the ring, Jason. You're fighting his mind games, his intimidation. You've been through the physical wars, but this is going to test you in ways you haven't felt before." Jason stopped punching. For a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, he turned to Ben and nodded. "I know, but if he thinks I'm going to let him break me, he's wrong. I fought for too long to let someone like him take me down mentally or physically." Ben smiled, a small but knowing grin. "That's the spirit. Just remember, this fight isn't just about standing strong. It's about standing strong. Pay in the face of everything he throws at you. You can't let him control the pace. You control it. You've done it before. Just stay focused." Jason gave a small nod and went back to work, each punch a reminder of the battle ahead. He had faced opponents who were physically stronger, who had more experience, but none of them had played the mind games that Rick Harrison was known for. Jason knew he had to be prepared for anything. As the days passed, the tension began to build. News outlets were picking up the story, and the fight between Jason and Rick was quickly becoming one of the most anticipated matchups in recent memory. Fans and analysts alike were buzzing with speculation about who would come out on top. But Jason, for all the attention, stayed focused. He knew that the battle wasn't just about impressing the fans, it was about proving something to himself. The day of the fight finally arrived. Jason stood backstage, dressed in his fight gear, the hum of the crowd outside making the air feel thick with anticipation. He had faced huge arenas before, but this felt different. There was an energy in the air that he couldn't shake off. As the announcer's voice echoed through the stadium, Jason's mind focused. He was no longer concerned with the noise of the crowd or the cameras capturing every moment. He was concerned with one thing only: Rick Harrison. The cage door opened, and Jason stepped out, the roar of the crowd hitting him like a wave. He couldn't afford to let himself be distracted. Not now. Rick was waiting for him in the center of the cage, a smug grin on his face, as if he already knew the outcome of this fight. His eyes locked with Jason's, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. Jason took a deep breath, stepping into the cage, The door slammed shut behind him and there was no turning back. He had come this far, and now it was time to face the darkness, both of Rick Harrison and the fears within himself. The fight wasn't just about punches and kicks. It was about proving that no matter how dark things got, no matter how much Rick tried to break him, Jason could stand strong. He would show the world and himself that real strength wasn't just about the physical battle. It was about what you were made of inside. The bell rang. The fight began. Are you ready for the next chapter? What would you do if you had to face a challenge like Jason's? Could you stand strong in the face of adversity, or would you let the pressure break you? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. This fight is far from over and the toughest battle is yet to come. The cage was silent, save for the sound of Jason's breath, the rhythmic beat of his heart pounding in his chest. Rick the Beast Harrison stood across from him, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous confidence, as if the world was his playground and everyone else was just a pawn. But Jason, in that moment, wasn't intimidated. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Rick win, not this time. As the bell rang, signaling the beginning of the round, Jason could feel the electric tension in the air. This wasn't just another fight for him. This was personal. This was more than proving himself in the ring. This was about showing Rick and the world that intimidation and mind games had no place here. Jason was going to fight on his terms. Rick lunged forward, his fists a blur as he came at Jason with an intensity that could only be described as primal. Jason, however, was prepared. He ducked under Rick's first punch, his body moving like a well-oiled machine. He wasn't just using his strength and technique. He was using his mind. He had trained himself to anticipate his opponent's moves, to see them before they happened. And Rick, despite all his bluster, wasn't going to throw him off track. Rick tried again, swinging wildly, his anger fueling every punch. But Jason was calm. He was the eye of the storm, watching and waiting, reading Rick's body language. Jason knew that Rick's power came from his ability to dominate mentally. But Jason wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let Rick turn this into a battle of egos. With a quick sidestep, Jason landed a punch to Rick's ribs. The impact sent a jolt through Rick's body, but it didn't seem to faze him. If anything, it only made him angrier. Rick launched a ferocious uppercut, aiming for Jason's chin, but Jason anticipated it. He blocked the punch, using the momentum to spin around and land a solid kick to Rick's midsection. For the first time in the fight, Rick staggered back, winded. It was a moment of vulnerability, one Jason had been waiting for. But just as Jason moved in for the follow-up, Rick's demeanor changed. He wasn't just the chaotic fighter anymore. There was something more calculated behind his eyes, something darker. He wasn't just fighting to win, he was fighting to destroy. And that change in energy hit Jason like a brick wall. Rick surged forward again, but this time he was more patient. His strikes were more deliberate, each one designed to put Jason on the defensive. The intensity in the cage was palpable, and for a moment it felt like everything was spiraling into a violent dance of aggression. Jason felt the heat of the battle. The sweat, the bruises, the pain. But there was a part of him deep down that refused to let go. The memories of the fight with Mark, the lessons he had learned, fueled his resolve. He remembered how easy it would have been to retaliate in anger, how easy it would have been to let the situation break him. But he had learned something that night. True strength wasn't in reacting to chaos. It was in rising above it. Then, with a sharp exhale, Jason saw his opening. Rick lunged forward. Again, but this time his footwork was sloppy, and Jason saw the crack in his defense. With the precision that had defined his career, Jason slid in, landing a devastating jab to Rick's chin that sent him reeling backward. The crowd erupted into a roar, but Jason didn't stop. He didn't let the noise distract him. Rick stumbled, his back hitting the cage, but before he could recover, Jason was on him. Every strike, every move Jason made now carried the weight of his years of experience, his ability to stay calm under pressure. He wasn't fighting to prove he was the better man. He was fighting to prove he was unbreakable. Rick's guard was slipping. His movements were growing more erratic, fueled by anger and desperation. He swung wildly, but Jason dodged again, closing the gap. And then, with a perfect left hook, Jason delivered the blow that sealed Rick's fate. Rick's body crumpled to the ground, his hands falling limp at his sides. The arena fell into a stunned silence. For a long moment, Jason stood over him, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His eyes locked on Rick, who was now struggling to regain his composure. The referee moved in, checking on Rick's condition. After a brief pause, he called it. Jason Statham was the victor. The crowd exploded into cheers, but Jason didn't move. He stood there, his gaze never leaving Rick, as if to say, "This is what happens when you try to break me." Jason raised his hand in the air as the announcer declared him the winner, but he didn't feel the need for the spotlight. The moment of victory was fleeting, but the lesson was eternal. This fight wasn't just about winning a trophy or a title. It was about proving that strength wasn't in the chaos of the battle, but in the ability to stay grounded when everything around you was trying to tear you apart. Jason had faced the darkness, both inside himself and in his opponent, and come out on top. As he left the cage, Jason's mind wandered to Mark Bradford. He had come a long way since that fight. He had learned to handle the pressure, to face his own demons. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real victory. Not the title, not the fame, but the personal growth. The ability to rise above it all and stay true to who you are. Jason walked backstage, his body aching, but a sense of peace settled in. He wasn't the same man who had entered that cage. He had grown, and not just as a fighter, but as a person. The door to his locker room swung open, and Charlie walked in, a grin spreading across his face. "You did it, mate," he said, slapping him on the back. "You took down the beast. You've earned the respect of the world. But more importantly, you've earned your own respect." Not many fighters can say that. Jason smiled faintly, nodding. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about facing the fear, the chaos, and coming out stronger on the other side. Charlie chuckled. "Yeah, well, you definitely did that. Now what's next for you?" Jason took a deep breath and looked toward the door, knowing that the journey wasn't over yet. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I'll be ready." "And what about you? What do you think Jason's victory meant? What lesson did he learn from his battle with Rick? If you were in his shoes, how would you have handled the fight, physically and mentally? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. This one may be over, but life never stops throwing challenges our way. Stay strong, stay grounded, and always be ready for the next fight.